He followed a trail of smoke into the desert and found two Apache sisters bound for a fate worse than death. One gunfight later, his blood soaked the sand, and their people carried him into judgment. By nightfall, enemies rode in demanding revenge, and the choice he made in that camp would decide where his life truly belonged. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight, friends? The wide desert, a busy city, or somewhere far from here? Let me tell you the story of Benjamin Hayes and the spring judgment that changed everything. The desert was waking slow that morning, its breath still cool with the last sigh of night. Light came leaking over the far ridges in a slow-poured gold, touching the stone and bushes as though it had all the time in the world. Benjamin Hayes sat his saddle at the edge of that light, his hat brim low, eyes narrowed against the day that was coming. The wind had a faint sting, carrying the dry smell of sage and something else, wood smoke, thin and distant. It threaded through the stillness in a way that pricked at his instincts, for smoke did not drift in such quiet without a story beneath it. He rode toward it, the sound of his horse's hooves muffled in the packed earth. His shadows stretched long beside him, wavering over the pale stones. He had learned long ago not to hurry toward the unknown, but there was a pull in his chest, a nagging sense of wrong that no measured pace could quiet. The nearer he came, the more the wind carried. Not the busy crackle of a campfire, but the brittle hush of something interrupted. And then he saw it. The trail dipped into a shallow ravine where a wagon lay tipped on its side, its canvas torn and burned at the edges. Barrels lay split, their contents scattered, flour blooming white against the red dust, a tin plate rocking in the breeze. There were hoof prints, sharp and fresh, leading away toward the stone teeth of the hills. Benjamin reined in and listened, letting the stillness speak. A faint sound reached him, almost lost in the wind, a muffled cry cut short. He followed it without thought. He found them in the shelter of a boulder, guarded by three men whose faces bore the dust and tiredness of long roads, but none of the ease of honest travel. The two women sat on the ground, wrists bound before them, hair loose and tangled from struggle. Their clothing was of the Apache, woven skirts, beaded sashes, the subtle patterns of their people's handiwork. One's eyes were dark and steady despite the fear that tightened her jaw. The other's gaze flitted between the men, calculating, waiting. They could not have been more than 25, 26 at most. Benjamin stayed in the shadow of a mesa, weighing the scene. He knew the look of a kidnapping meant for ransom, or worse. His gut turned hard. He thought of a spring years back, of his sister's laughter vanishing into the dust behind riders he could not catch. He had been younger then, slower, too full of hesitation. It had carved something deep in him, a hollow that never closed. Looking at these women, he felt the old wound stirring. Urging, he rode forward slow, his voice even, told the men the desert wasn't kind to those who made enemies where none were needed. Offered a trade, supplies, coin, anything to see the women freed. The eldest of them, wearing a sun-faded Mexican cavalry jacket, spat into the dust and told him to keep riding unless he wanted trouble. Another laughed, the sound sharp as a snapped twig. Benjamin's hand rested on the worn grip of his Colt. The younger sister looked at him then, her gaze locking with his, not pleading, not breaking. It was a challenge, a dare to see whether the man on the horse was worth the dust on his boots. That was the moment the balance tipped. He moved first. His revolver was a blur, the crack splitting the air and dropping the man in the jacket before the others had drawn. Gunfire erupted, hot and shattering. Benjamin felt the first bullet tear into his shoulder, spinning him half around in the saddle. Another punched into his side, another into his thigh. He gritted against the pain, firing back, each shot a piece of himself given away. The world narrowed to the smell of gunpowder and the rasp of his own breath. When the last man fell, silence rushed in like water into a breached hole. Benjamin's vision wavered. He swayed, felt the saddle slip from under him, and hit the ground hard. The women's bindings were gone in a heartbeat, their hands warm, steady, pressing against his wounds. They spoke to each other in low, urgent Apache, tearing strips from their skirts to stop the bleeding. He wanted to tell them to run, that more might be coming, but the words dissolved on his tongue. They half-dragged, half-lifted him onto his horse, one leading the reins while the other kept pressure on his side. The journey blurred, stone and sky passing in jolts, the rhythm of hooves like a far-off drum. Then there was the scent of wood smoke again, richer now, mingled with cooking meat and the faint tang of tanned hides. The camp unfolded from the shadows of cottonwoods, hides stretched between poles, children darting like quick birds. Women bent to their work. Men stood watch, their eyes sharp as hawks. The two sisters called out, and the camp shifted, faces turning, voices rising in recognition and relief. A man stepped forward, tall and broad, his hair bound with a strip of red cloth. His eyes found the wounds before they found Benjamin's face. The look he gave him held the weight of understanding and a gratitude that needed no words. Benjamin was eased onto a bedroll inside a low shelter of hides. The air was warm, smelling of cedar and smoke. Time slipped in and out. He surfaced to see one sister spooning broth toward his lips, to feel the other's hand on his forehead, cool and sure. Sometimes they spoke to him in soft tones, their voices like music he did not understand, but felt all the same. On the third day he managed more than a few words, rough and slow, told them his name, asked for theirs. The older was Clara, the younger Grace. They told him fragments of their capture, how they had been taken on the trail to a trading post, how the men who held them had spoken of selling them across the border. Benjamin's jaw tightened at that, but they touched his arm as though to ease the storm they saw gathering in him. By the seventh evening he could sit propped against a woven mat. The camp was quieter than usual, the sun spilling its last gold over the hills. The tall man, Clara and Grace's father, the chief, entered and sat beside him. His voice was like stone worn smooth by years of water. He told Benjamin that his daughters had been returned because of him, and that such a debt could not be left unsettled. He offered him a place among their people, not as a guest but as kin. Benjamin felt the pull of it after so many years drifting from town to town. The idea of belonging tugged at him in a way he did not expect. But before he could shape an answer, shouts rose from the edge of camp. Riders crested the horizon, dark against the dying light. 6 of them, hard-faced and armed. Benjamin knew them by the cut of their coats and the hunger in their eyes. Kin of the men he'd killed, riding for vengeance. The camp moved quick. Men took up rifles. Women pulled children into shelters. Benjamin pushed to his feet, the pain in his wounds flaring white, but he reached for his Colt all the same. The chief told him to stay down, but Benjamin shook his head. He would not lie in the dark while others stood in his place. The riders came fast, their yells cutting the evening air. The first shots cracked, echoing against the stone. Benjamin took position beside the chief, bracing against a post, his revolver steady despite the weakness in his limbs. Dust and gunfire mingled in the air, the world reduced to flashes of movement and the raw rhythm of survival. A rider broke through the line, bearing down on the sisters, and Benjamin stepped forward into the path, firing until the man fell. Pain roared through him, his body threatening to give, but he held fast. The sky above had deepened to a bruised purple, and in its shadowed glow, the last rider turned to flee. Benjamin took one step after him, then another, and the ground seemed to sway beneath him like the deck of a ship. His knees buckled, the world tilting, the sounds of the camp blurring into a far-off hum. He heard someone calling his name, felt the brush of hands at his shoulders, and then there was nothing but the sound of his own breath, ragged and fading, and the knowledge that he had stood where he was needed and would again if he had the strength. The night closed around him, thick with the scent of smoke and iron, the echoes of the battle still hanging in the air like a promise not yet fulfilled.